Just by way of introduction of Steve Werle, who's our speaker today. I actually met Steve for the first time, I think it was probably 10 years ago next week. And the occasion is that Steve and I, our children are the same age, and so each of our oldest child were going into kindergarten, and one of the other parents had a pre-kindergarten social. So we met then, and then over the course of the next year got to know each other. Steve's a social studies teacher at Academy of Holy Angels, and in the course of getting to know each other, he learned, as I mentioned before, that I was a history major and I like history. One of the things that makes Steve special is that he's genuinely interested in other people. I mean, he's just kind of absorbing information from people all the time, right? So he's a great relationship guy. And he says to me one day, about 9 years ago, he says, you know, since you love history, you'd probably be really interested in something that I'm working on. I said, what's that? He says, I'm going to write a book about Harold Stassen. I said, okay, that is cool, because I'm a history major, and I knew 3 things about Harold Stassen at the time. He had a really bad toupee. He'd run for president 9 times, and he was the U.S. One of the delegate members for the United States to the United Nations Conference, right? So that was pretty much my knowledge of Harold Stassen, even though he was a Minnesota guy. This is probably the worst thing you can do to somebody who's writing a book, is that from that point on, every time I saw Steve, I said, how's the book coming? Right? It's coming along, right? I was fortunate was it last fall when the book came out? Was it September? Was it spring? Oh, it was March. Okay, so one of the other parents at school hosted a book reading on the day that the book was released, and it was special for me to be sitting in the room to see a friend who is celebrating an accomplishment, one that is truly worthy of recognition based on I know how much work he put into it, and I would imagine it was gratifying for Steve too to stand in front of a group that has become in large part a support system for him to feel that acknowledgement, but more importantly to talk about his passion. And so because this is an individual who has deep Minnesota history and is a figure of importance and significance in Minnesota history that probably doesn't get his due, I thought this would be a great learning opportunity for Rotarians, especially since he spent some time here in the city of Bloomington. So with that very brief introduction, I'd like to present to Steve Werle, who's going to talk about Harold Stassen.
Thank you, Jamie. I just realized it took me as long to write this book as it took to get my son through elementary and middle school. It was a long path, but I appreciate the comments. The feeling is mutual, and my son too has his permit. So good luck with that. Good luck with that. I just realized when I walked in this room, the last time I was in this exact room is several years ago. I was the prom coordinator at my high school, and we used to have it at Hazeltine Golf Course. And I don't know if any of you remember, several years ago, Hazeltine completely shut down for a year to completely renovate, and I had to come up with the task of finding a new place to have it. Now, this was a wonderful location. It was a relatively new hotel, but I have to tell you how much better it is to be here with all of you than 300 high school students who are scarfing down their food and getting ready to dance, or some sort of proximity of what they call dance. So it's wonderful to be here. I very much appreciate it. I have to tell you, the question that I always get asked is why Harold Stassen? Why would you research Harold Stassen? And actually, Jamie, your comments were very timely. About 11 years ago, I took a year off from teaching. I've been a high school history teacher for 21 years, and I took a year off to work for Dakota County. And I was working at the Dakota County Historical Society. Tom, can I take this off? Is that all right? Can I take it out? Sorry, I move around a lot in the classroom, so I hope this is okay. And I was sitting at a beautiful, beautiful oak desk, and I asked one of my colleagues, where did this desk come from? This is a really nice desk. And she said, she was the librarian at the Dakota County Historical Society, and she said, well, that belonged to Governor Stassen. And I gave her this look. I realize now that some of you who are married can associate with the look of when your spouse says, like, the Johnsons are coming over for dinner, remember we said we'd host them? And you give them that look like, yes, of course, of course. And I said, oh, absolutely, Governor. It's got the drawers and everything. And I had no idea who Governor Stassen was when she said that, but I faked it. And that night, I went home and I jumped online and I looked up everything I could about Harold Stassen. And little by little, over the course of the next 6 months, I found articles, I found references to him. And the more I learned about him, the more I kept asking myself the question, why has nobody written a book about this man's life? Why has nobody taken the time to research and then present to other people all that this man has achieved? And so the question of why is perfectly natural until you read the book, and then it just explains itself. I love your theme, be a gift to the world. I didn't know that until I came here. But after you learn a little bit more about Harold Stassen, I think you'll realize he is one of the great gifts that Minnesota made to the world in terms of international peace, justice, civil rights, morality. He is one of our great state and national treasures, and it was my goal to present that to as many people as I possibly could. The other reason I researched Harold Stassen is I believe as a history teacher I have an obligation, a professional obligation, but even really an ethical obligation to make history proximate, to make it close. You all know Dred Scott Field. You know it's named for Dred Scott, who was at Fort Snelling. You know the story of the Dred Scott case. Well, when I talk to my students about the Civil War and the causes of the Civil War, I spent a lot of time letting them know where Dred Scott was, who he was, his wife Harriet, why they were here, and then the results of that. And the closer I can make history to them, it's, you know, the old saying, all politics is local. I believe all history is local, and the closer you are to it, the more impassioned you are about it. And speaking of that, Jamie said at the very end of his life, Governor Stassen was at, is it called Friendship Village? That's where he passed away about 6 months after his wife. So he was very late in his life. He lived right here in Bloomington. So I've got a couple slides here that I want to share with you, and I'm very, very appreciative of your time. I'll try to be as brief as I can. A friend sent this to me, and it says, do you guys remember the old cartoonist, the single-plane cartoonist in the Tribune by the name of, thank you very much, Gindin. This is a great one. Honey, do you think there will be much demand for a one-man show featuring an imitation of Harold Stassen? And I put this, I didn't get on Facebook until the book came out because my editor said, you know, it's a great way to create word of mouth. And so I put it on my Facebook page about 2 weeks ago, and one of my friends said, I think I wrote in there, I'm not saying these two people resemble anyone in my house, I'm just saying. And a friend of mine said, dude, that is awesome, that is right on, your wife has been making fun of this for years. And then my mother-in-law wrote on there and said, tread lightly. Tread lightly. And she was right. My wife was very supportive, but she kept wanting to know, when is this book going to come to fruition? When is this going to be done? And Jamie was one of the few people who, when I said I'm working on this book, was genuinely interested. Most people looked at me like they wanted to have a conversation with somebody else. So here's a great one from Steve Sack. I found this in the, let me move so I'm not blocking anybody. This was in the Star Tribune in about 2012. A gallery of Minnesota also-rans, Eugene McCarthy, Hubert Humphrey, Harold Stassen, very short there in stature. The irony, of course, is Harold Stassen was very tall. He was about 6'3". It's very symbolic, short in stature with the bronze-colored toupee. Walter Mondale, Tim Pawlenty. This is shortly after Tim Pawlenty had pulled out of the 2012 race in the primaries when he had come in a dismal, almost last in the Iowa straw poll, which we finally gotten rid of, thank God. And then, of course, the reference here to Michelle Bachmann, the guy's just waiting to put her picture up there as well. True story. True story. Steve Sack's brother, Mike, his older brother, Mike, teaches with me at Holy Angels. He's been there since 1979. Steve Sack comes to our school once a year and presents in his brother's classroom, and he does this wonderful thing. He tells the kids, give me a current day issue that you're studying. Give me a current events issue. And they'll give it to him, and he'll just go up to the board, and he'll make a wonderful picture of it with a comment. It's amazing. The guy is incredible in his awareness of what's going on in the world and then his ability to kind of penetrate it. So Mike knew I was working on this book. He brings Steve up, and I kid you not, I'm right in the middle of an AP US history class. He brings his brother in, and I said, Steve Sack? And I went and grabbed this, and I had him sign it. And I was giddy at having him in there. And afterwards, he left. I introduced him to my students. He leaves, and I turn around, and some kid in class goes, "That was really weird, Mr. Worley. You were way too excited to see him." I said, "Well, he's kind of a legend, in the editorial business." So I asked Steve Sack if he had any other ones about Harold Stassen, and he said, "Oh, I got a bunch. Let me go back to the office and find them." This is the one he sent me the next day via email, and it appears in the book. And of course, it's perfect. It's perfect for, if you know that Harold Stassen ran over and over and over again, he's got the kind of Rolodex, the calendar there. It's very interesting. When I talk about Harold Stassen to people, do you remember that Grand Casino commercial that says, "What's your Grand Casino story?" It's kind of like everybody's got, "What's your Harold Stassen story?" I just heard one from Mr. Carlson, Jack Carlson, a couple minutes ago. He told me a great story about Harold Stassen. And in the research I did, many people criticized him for not having a sense of humor. And I just heard a story from Jack that would absolutely stand contrary to that. It was a great story, very funny story, making fun of himself kind of story. About 1984, somebody asked him, "Governor, why do you keep running for president?" Of course, Ronald Reagan ran virtually unopposed, and Harold Stassen said, "I'm running this year to make Ronald Reagan look younger." Okay? Which is great. By the end, I'll tell you why he kept running over and over again in his own words. The reality is, Harold Stassen was the boy wonder of Minnesota politics in the 1930s and 40s. He was born in West St. Paul on his family's farm, went to the University of Minnesota. He had graduated from high school when he was only 15 years old. He graduated from the University of Minnesota by the time he was 19. He had his law degree by the time he was 23. Became county attorney in Dakota County, down in Hastings. And then in 1938, he decided to run for governor. He's elected overwhelmingly, and he becomes the youngest governor in our nation's history at that time. He was only 31 years old. And that's when his national reputation began. And one of the things that made him really unique as a Republican at that time is he was a moderate Republican. He was a progressive Republican. And, it's really interesting. I was at a retreat this last weekend. I was very grateful that on Thursday I was not around to watch the debate on Thursday night. And the truth of the matter is that those aren't really debates. They're really Q&As. And they're really meant to have kind of a gotcha moment. And I told a friend it'd be a great SNL skit to have those debates and then have like trap doors under the people, and when they say something that is just absolutely ridiculous, just have the trap door open, they go down, and now we're down to 9. And then we're down to 8. I was going to start this book with a debate that took place in 1948, a true debate between Harold Stassen and Governor Thomas Dewey of New York on the radio. 40 to 80 million people were listening. It was going to be the largest radio audience to date. And it had one question. One of the candidates would be affirmative, the other would be opposed, and they would debate it out on the radio. The question was, 1948, can you imagine a more controversial question than this in 1948? Should the Communist Party be outlawed in the United States? And they debated that for an hour. And I was going to start the book with that, and my editor, very smartly, it hurt at the time, but it was very smart, she said, "Steve, that's a great story, but I don't think it's going to work in the prologue." And I said, "Why not?" And she said, "You got to start where people are. You got to meet your reader where they are." And of course, what she meant was the toupee and running for president over and over again. So that's the prologue. Later in the book, I go through that debate, but it's a wonderful example of intelligent, politically astute statesmen debating the most critical issue of the day. And then winner take all. It ended up being kind of the high point and eventually the turning point in Harold Stassen's career. But in 1940, he was an up-and-comer, a rising progressive voice in the Republican Party. This is a great picture. This appears not in the book, but in a number of presentations I've done. In 1940, Harold Stassen was governor, and he was asked to give the keynote address at the 1940 Republican National Nominating Convention in Philadelphia. It's a huge honor for somebody who hasn't even reached his 37th birthday, okay? And the man on the far left right here is Henrik Shipstead, Minnesota's congressman. Now, Henrik Shipstead was at one time a Republican, but then he had left the Republican Party and joined something in Minnesota called the Farmer Labor Party. He realized that the Farmer Labor Party was kind of on the rise, and he wanted to be in that party. And the man in the center is Wendell Willkie. And the great thing about this story is Wendell Willkie represented for Republicans in 1940, not only an outsider, this is the first political office he ever ran for, president, aiming pretty high. He had made his money in utilities, he was a very wealthy man, he was a very successful businessman, but he was an internationalist. Remember, this is a year before Pearl Harbor. So in 1940, Wendell Willkie is already talking about the Republican Party needing to open up its mind to the possibility that the United States had a major role to play in international politics. What's interesting about this picture is it takes place in St. Paul shortly after Willkie won the nomination, and Harold Stassen had helped make that happen in 1940 by not only giving the keynote address, but then breaking from tradition and saying, I think Wendell Willkie should be president. Now, one of the theories that I have in the book is that forever cut his ties with the powers that be in the Republican Party. They were frustrated. They didn't like the idea that an outsider, a liberal outsider, a moderate outsider, an internationalist, had come in and taken the nomination, and they blamed Harold Stassen for it. So guys like Arthur Vandenberg, Thomas Dewey, Robert Taft, Richard Nixon, Joe McCarthy, these guys would never forgive Harold Stassen for his moderate approach in 1940, and it was only going to get worse after that. He served in World War II. Imagine this, folks. Imagine this. A sitting governor of the state of Minnesota during war saying he had won in 1938. He wins re-election in 1940. Prior to the election in 1942, he announces to the electorate, I'm going to run again, but I plan on resigning my office after the first legislative session because this war is going to be fought of men of my generation, and I believe I should be with them. He didn't have to. He was considered what was considered essential civilian personnel at that time. But he told the voters, I will resign. I want a new lieutenant governor. His name's going to be Ed Thigh, a farmer from Northfield, Minnesota, who had become a close personal friend of the governor's. And he not only won, he won by the largest margin he had ever won by, okay? And keeping his word, in the spring of 1943, he resigned as governor and then went and trained at the Great Lakes Naval Station in Chicago. And he entered U.S. Naval Reserve. This is him with Chester Nimitz, one of the men that he served under. The bulk of his time was under Bull Halsey in World War II in the 3rd Fleet. Have any of you read the book Unbroken about Louis Zapparini? I suspect several of you have, and then made into a movie. Harold Stassen was charged with the task in 1945, shortly after the surrender, the end of World War II, which we're celebrating the 70th anniversary of this summer. He was charged with the task by Bull Halsey of going in and liberating 20,000 American, British, Dutch prisoners of the Japanese. And one of the camps that you read about or saw in Unbroken was called Omori, and it was right in Tokyo Bay. And Harold Stassen went in. Now, at that time, Louis Zapparini had been moved into the mountains, if you've read that book. But this was the ranking officer that he liberated, a guy many of you will remember, a guy by the name of Greg Pappy Boyington. You ever heard of Black Sheep Squadron? So this is Greg Boyington, who had gone down early in the war, was presumed dead, had already been given the Congressional Medal of Honor, assuming that he was dead. And as Halsey's planes went over Omori, I get goosebumps every time I say this, the men had whitewashed on top of the barracks, Boyington here. They had written Boyington here. And within the next 24 hours, Harold Stassen had come ashore. And this is shortly after the first meeting between Harold Stassen and Pappy Boyington. This is when they've taken him on to the hospital ship. And Boyington wrote in his memoirs later that Harold Stassen walked up to him and said, Pappy, we're sure glad to see you. We thought you were dead. And Boyington turned. They had seen each other earlier in the war and said, thank you for coming, Lieutenant Commander. What took you so long? And Stassen said, once we saw the footage, the aerial footage that you were here, we couldn't wait one more day to get you out. So it's a wonderfully touching scene. In the midst of his war experience, Harold Stassen, I spent a whole chapter on this. It's also the 70th anniversary of the creating of the United Nations. Harold Stassen was still very young, lieutenant commander in the U.S. Naval Reserve, when Franklin Roosevelt appointed him and 6 other delegates to represent the United States at the founding ceremony, founding charter writing convention in San Francisco. Harold Stassen had said ever since college that the goal in his life was to help establish world peace. He'd always believed world peace was more important than anything else that he could achieve in his life. He became an international lawyer. This was his one great moment to make a substantial contribution to that idea. And what's great about this is, I'm going to show you a picture in just a minute of the delegates. Franklin Roosevelt had learned a lot from history. You may remember from your high school history classes, you might remember learning about Woodrow Wilson and the League of Nations, and it was partisan. The idea was that Democrats and Democrats alone were going to take credit for that, and it didn't ever get signed here in the United States. Republicans in the U.S. Senate stopped it. Franklin Roosevelt sent 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats and his Secretary of State to negotiate the UN Charter. And he did it because he didn't want it to be a partisan issue. And Harold Stassen would not only represent young progressive Republicans, he'd also represent 16 million men and women in uniform, because he was the only one on the delegation who had actually served in the armed forces during World War II. Now, I want to show you, this is a very famous picture, and the central figure in here, almost everybody will know, okay? This is Douglas MacArthur making good on his famous promise of, "I shall return to the Philippines." But there's a figure in this picture who I've always found, I've taught about MacArthur for many, many years, and there's a figure in this picture that I've always wondered about, and it's this guy right here, okay? Shorter than the rest. He's Filipino. He's a general in the Filipino army, and his name is, it took me a while to find this out, his name is Carlos Romulo. He was a lawyer, a diplomat, a college professor, and then he ended up becoming an aide to Douglas MacArthur during World War II. And this is one of those, this is a true story. You're not going to believe it, but this is an absolutely true story. In the midst of this research, I went to New York City, and I did research at the United Nations. My brother worked out there. I'd never been to Manhattan. I stayed in his hotel room with him, and I went up there, and I asked, what do you have from the founding convention? And they said, you know, we really don't have a lot. You're welcome to look around our library. And I was there for 3 days, and on the second day, I walked over to a shelf, and I found these leather-bound books, and I opened it up, and they were the original typewritten, bound manuscript from the convention. And I said, bullseye. I got it. So I looked through, and I found out that Harold Stassen was in charge of what was called the Trusteeship Committee. So imagine this. In 1945, you've got a lot of countries in the world, a lot of what we'd consider first world countries after World War II, Britain, France, the United States, Russia, Germany, all of these countries at one time or another had overseas colonies of various size, various shape, and in various places. Well, the goal of the committee that Harold Stassen was chair of was to figure out how the rest of the world, okay, parts of Asia, parts of Africa, parts of South America, would eventually gain self-government and independence. So, Carlos Romulo is representing the Philippines, which up until a year before had been part of the United States. So when Harold Stassen was born in 1907, U.S. soldiers, Marines, were actually in the Philippines and basically keeping our interests in the Philippines our interests, not the Filipinos' interests. Okay, it's part of this American empire. So there's a debate that I found the transcript for. And the debate is between Carlos Romulo, this short representative of the Philippines, and the British delegate, a guy by the name of Lord Cranborne. What a great British name, Lord Cranborne, right? Okay? And in the midst of this debate, Lord Cranborne says, we've come up with language that describes the rest of you countries, and we're going to put the word self-government in there. And Romulo gets the chair's attention and says, "Sir, with respect, we'd like to see the word independence included in the UN Charter." And Cranborne quickly dismisses him, as a Dutch delegate would have done, a French delegate would have done this, and he quickly dismisses him and says, no, you don't understand, sir. The world is like a ladder, he says. The world is like a ladder. And on the top of the ladder are advanced people who can govern themselves, and at the bottom of the ladder are people who can't take care of themselves yet. And in what must have been a remarkably intriguing rebuttal, Romulo says, "Sir, my English isn't as good as yours, I acknowledge that. But I think what you're referring to is countries standing on their own and not relying on others for help. And if that's what you're referring to, I would ask you to acknowledge any country in the world that in the last 4 years hasn't needed somebody else's help." And he was saying this to the British representative. Absolutely unassailable argument, right? The rest of the delegates cheer. Cranborne sits down and shortly later leaves the hall. And I wanted something, I was hoping for something that would represent Stassen's humanity. I never met him. I talked with his family members, but I never met him personally. And I kid you not, I was, Holy Angels, for those of you who are familiar with our campus, is a very old building. It was built in 1931. Every year I give away at our school auction what's called a tunnel tour. We have tunnels underneath the school, which kids from like the 40s and 50s say, "Oh yeah, we were in those all the time." No, they weren't. But they say it, and then their kids and grandkids all go, "My parents were in the tunnels." No, they weren't. So I give a tour every year where we go down into those tunnels and I show them kind of the what's down there, the storage. About 4 years ago, I was giving one, and there's a lot of books down there that the nuns just put down there. And I came up, and with a flashlight in the middle of this tour, I went down. There's a book by Carlos Romulo called Crusade in Asia. I kid you not. I open it up, and I look in the index, and I see if the name Harold Stassen's in there. It is, and I'm getting goosebumps. And I turn to the page where Carlos Romulo describes the exact debate that I just told you about, and he says afterwards, Harold Stassen of the United States picked up a pencil, wrote on a slip of paper something, handed it to an aide who walked it over to me. I opened it up and it said, "Congratulations, we're proud of you." In other words, you stood up to the British delegate, and guess what word ends up in the UN Charter? Independence. Independent. Major turning point in world history, that these countries will seek independence. And of course, for people from India, okay, for people from many, many parts of the world, World War II was that great turning point, and it is the opening of that era of justice and equality among nations. Okay, so this is that delegation. I just want to show you. I don't normally point out backs of people's heads, but I'm going to show you. This is Harold Stassen. This is the Secretary of State, Edward Stettinius. This is Arthur Vandenberg, senator from Michigan, at one time an ardent isolationist who came around, became one of the great spokespersons for the UN. This is Adlai Stevenson, okay? And this picture, I have a version of it from a different angle, and over here, between Adlai Stevenson and Harold Stassen are two figures you'd also be familiar with. One is Nelson Rockefeller, and the other, of course, John Foster Dulles, who were there as kind of aides to these 7 delegates. I love this picture. It's got so many figures that in the 1950s and 60s would become prominent figures in American foreign policy. All right, 1946, Harold Stassen comes home. Good money had him running for the U.S. Senate. Now, he could have won that. It would have been against Henrik Shipstead, who had gone from the House into the Senate. By the way, I told you the UN Charter had the word independence on it. It was voted on in the U.S. Senate. It was passed almost unanimously. Only 2 people voted against it. One of them was Henrik Shipstead from Minnesota. Instead of running for that seat, Harold Stassen tells Ed Thigh, who had taken over as governor, "You should run for the Senate. My skills are more oriented toward administration. I'm not a legislator, I'm an administrator." Okay? This is down in Winona, Farmers Community Park. I used to hang out. I'm from Rochester originally. We used to go on school trips and hang out at Farmers Community Park. This is in 1946. Believe it or not, already Harold Stassen was campaigning for president, excuse me. You think election cycles start early today? You can thank Harold Stassen. He was already announcing that he would seek the nomination in 1948. Okay, so here is that great campaign of 48. This is that debate I was telling you about right here. Thomas Dewey speaking on the radio. Harold Stassen getting ready for his rebuttal. Thomas Dewey, I love this. I found in a book, Theodore Roosevelt's oldest daughter, Alice, who was born of his first wife, very caustic, very, very critical of others, but had great one-liners. And her one-liner about Thomas Dewey was, she had two of them. She said, whenever I looked at Thomas Dewey, I couldn't help but think of the little groom on the wedding cake. Have you ever seen the little, okay. And then she said, he had run in 44 and lost. He's running again in 48. Somebody said, Mrs. Roosevelt, Longworth Roosevelt at that time, what do you think of Thomas Dewey? And she says, I oppose him on the theory that you can't make a souffle rise twice. And then Dewey ends up getting the nomination, but I love this cartoon going into Philadelphia. The spirit of 48. Fife and drum here, Dewey, Taft, they've beaten each other up, and here comes Harold Stassen with a drum on crutches. He comes in a distant third. The irony, of course, of that election, I tell my students, is this. Thomas Dewey, having won the nomination, listening to all of the polls, all of the newspapers, believes the election is his, and he doesn't really campaign. He decides to be above the fray. And of course, those of you who are old enough to remember know that Harry Truman ran one of the most vigorous, spirited whistle-stop campaigns in American political history, and he ends up winning that election. I do not doubt for a second that if Harold Stassen had gotten the nomination, he would not have sat on a back porch or a front porch. He would have campaigned vigorously. History may have been different. Harold Stassen, many people believe, would have made a great president. He just didn't know when to quit. Just a couple more slides here. 1952. This is just like being a teacher. I get applauded all the time. So it's not bothering me. I apologize if it bothers you. This happens spontaneously in class all the time. I'm sure you can imagine. Dwight Eisenhower here had brilliantly surrounded himself with two very intelligent international figures. One is John Foster Dulles, his Secretary of State, the man who had a pedigree for being Secretary of State. His grandfather and his great-uncle had both been Secretaries of State. Eisenhower said of John Foster Dulles, of course I'm going to appoint him. He's been studying to be Secretary of State since he was 6. Okay? But he also brought on Harold Stassen, first as his coordinator of foreign operations, and then he named him his special assistant on disarmament. And of course, I have an entire chapter on this. The White House was not large enough for these two figures. The press very quickly, and I find this very intriguing, the press very quickly dubbed Harold Stassen the Secretary of Peace. They said he's our nation's very first Secretary of Peace. And Eisenhower didn't have a problem with that because in 1955, when he did this, he wanted to show the Russians, the Soviets, that we were interested in peace. And he had no problem with the press calling him that. Well, John Foster Dulles had a big problem with that because he went to the president and said, if he's Secretary of Peace, what does that make me? You know, Secretary of saber rattling, Secretary of nuclear war. And in the end, Harold Stassen had burned too many bridges in the Republican Party. And one of the biggest bridges came in 52 and 56 when he tried to get Richard Nixon off the ticket. He did not believe that Richard Nixon had the moral aptitude to be President of the United States. Fascinating. And he tried to get him off, and he was never forgiven by either Nixon or Republicans who believed that he was trying to break the Republican Party up, when all he was really doing was saying, I don't think Richard Nixon should be president. So he ends up leaving in 1958. He then goes on to his international law practice. He goes back to Philadelphia, where he had lived for 4 years when he was president of the University of Pennsylvania, eventually coming back in the 1970s. I was with, over the weekend, I just have to tell you this real quick, and I know my time is just about up. He does try to run for the Senate against Rudy Boschwitz. Some of you might remember this. This was probably a very difficult time for Harold Stassen. Rudy Boschwitz had never been in politics before. I spent part of the weekend with the former chief of police, John Locks, I believe he was here, and they have this wonderful book sale they do every year, and I asked him where it was, and he says, "Do you remember where the old Plywood, Minnesota building is?" And I said, "No, but isn't that Rudy Boschwitz's business?" He said, "It sure is." And I said, "Boy, that reminds me of Harold Stassen." And so we talked a little bit, and then I realized for the last 8 years, everything has reminded me of Harold Stassen. And it's at that point I realized I really need to get a new hobby, okay? So I appreciate your attention very much. I do have copies of the book if you're interested. I'd be happy to inscribe it for you, and I'd love to take questions if there's time, and if there isn't, one question. Anybody? Make it a good one. That's a lot of pressure. Anybody have a question?
Where was Stassen living when he died in 2101?
Right here in Friendship Village. He's buried at Acacia Cemetery, right at Pilot Knob. And let me just say this: I think it's very interesting that he's buried there, Pilot Knob, Mississippi and Minnesota rivers, and his grave overlooks the airport. Now, what's interesting about that is the Metropolitan Airports Commission was formed in the 1940s under his leadership as governor. He believed that the Metropolitan Airports Commission needed to be created to help coordinate the functions of the airport. I'm sorry, Mr. Verbrugge, he did introduce me, so I kind of feel like I have to answer. Yeah.
It's not a question so much, but just a comment for those who might want to read the book. The thing that Steve does really well, this is less a biography than it is a history. And what Steve does really nicely in the book is he puts Harold Stassen in the context of his times, and then sort of juxtaposes that with how Harold Stassen impacted the times that he was a part of. So it's really a well-constructed book, and I highly commend it to all of you. And thanks, Steve, for coming.
My last comment is I was not involved in his first campaign.
Steve, thank you so much. And in appreciation of your speaking presentation, a donation to End Polio will be made in your name to End Polio Now, which is a signature project of Rotary International. In the early 1980s, there were about 400,000 cases of polio in the world each year, which is when Rotary decided to join with other organizations to lead the eradication of polio in the world. We are so close to eradicating this devastating disease. In 2015, we have had 33 cases in 2 countries. Success over polio will help fuel the energy for what people of the world can do when we work together. So here's a certificate in honor of your speaking today, and here is a End Polio Now pin.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you.